you know, and have extra, but I ain't gonna say yours, Sister Catherine. But in any event, this sister has transformed, and I've seen the transformation in her, even myself, because we're looking at elders who also transform. Because it doesn't matter when we do it, the important fact is that we're always doing it, and that it's a continuous process. And I know that she's aided me in the transformation that has evolved in my life, from that of being single to that of being married, from that of being selfish to that of being sharing. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce to some of you, and most importantly, present to all of you, the chairperson of First World Alliance, my friend, my sister, my Queen Mother, the one who stood for me at my wedding, Queen Mother, Sister Kepha. You can bring weight on me.
Hotep brothers and sisters. My son, Brother Wade Noble, would you take this platform, please? All right. Good. All right. The brother who comes to speak to us at this time comes from Oakland, California. He is a social psychologist and a prominent theoretical scientist in the field of African psychology. He is also a leading African-centered researcher on African family life. Brother Noble is a professor of African studies at San Francisco State University and is currently the executive director of the Institute for the Advanced Study of Black Family Life and Culture, Incorporated. Over the years, he has authored several books. Among these are Understanding the Black Family, a guide for scholarship and research, Africanity and the Black Family, the development of a theoretical model, the Kemet Husia, authoritative utterances of exceptional insight for the Black family, and African psychology towards its reclamation, reascension, and revitalization. I must also point out that he is an ASCAC National Executive Committee member and a National Board representative for the Western region of ASCAC. Brother Wade reminds us that African character is critical to the development of African development. It is the mark of mental and ethical traits of African people that distinguishes their quality. As we ascend in our African consciousness and deepen our thinking, this deepening of African thought within us transforms our character through understanding and lays a foundation for African ways of beingness and of becoming. A foundation for utilizing our African being to reshape the pathway of our existence and bring African truth to the world in our mission of building for eternity. Brother Noble's critical dialogue speaks to ancient Kemetic thought and practice, speaking truth and doing justice. Sisters and brothers, it is an African pleasure to bring forward and present to you our brother, Dr. Wade Noble.
It has become very clear to me every single day that the ancestors speak to us and through us. And the one principle that the ancestors like to remind us about is the principle of reciprocity. They do that in many different ways. A little while ago, a black man came into my country, into my place called Oakland, California. That's my country.
Okay.
And he was with my people and had the audacity to call out my name to see if I was in the audience because he was taking roll. This black man is one of my best friends. And so my son had the opportunity of standing up and sharing with his uncle that I was taking care of our business someplace else. In the tradition of reciprocity, I have to ask, is Lenny Jeffrey in the house? Is Lenny Jeffrey? And with my brother in the house, I can now ask my mother if I have your permission to teach. Thank you. It is with my great mother's permission that I ask you all to allow me to assume a posture of reverence and respect while I give praise and credit to the source of all knowledge, all truth, and all wisdom. And I do that by saying out loud and in front of you that the Almighty, who is sometimes called Amun, and is sometimes called Aset, and is sometimes called Ptah, and it is sometimes called Jehovah, and it is sometimes called Obatula, and it is sometimes called Seshach, and it is sometimes called the Christ, and it is sometimes called Shango, and it is sometimes called Allah, and it is sometimes called Oya, and it is sometimes called Olatumari, and it is sometimes called Atum. That Almighty God, Amun, Ptah, Ra, although hidden, is the source of all knowledge, all truth, and all wisdom. And I pray in what I share with you this evening that Amun, Tehuti, Orumila will be satisfied. I must begin my talk by addressing the title of Ancient Kemetic Thought and Practice, Speaking Truth and Doing Justice, by pointing out to you that I've taken the liberty in struggling and in studying and looking at the ancient Kemetic teachings to pay particular attention to every time I come across the word noble, for obvious reasons. And it is in the discovery of the word noble that I think I'm able to capture as a preface, the title, Speaking Truth and Doing Justice. It is Hawa, chief official of the high priestess of Amun-Ra, who has said, I am a noble, for whom one should act, one of firm heart to the end of life. I am one beloved in his city, praised by his district, kind-hearted to the towns. I have done what the people love and God praises. I was one truly venerated and had no fault. I gave bread to the hungry and clothes to the naked. I put an end to pain and I erased wrongdoings. I buried the blessed, supported the aged, and satisfied the needs of the have-nots. I was a shelter for the child and a help to the widow. I was one who gave rank even to the infant. I did these things knowing their value and knowing their reward for the Lord of Ma'at, the reward to endure in the mouth of my people without end, to be remembered, to be well remembered for years and years to come. I dedicate the teachings of Herwa to my brother, Lenny Jeffries. It is in fact the case that I would like to think in front of you around the question of ancient Kemetic thought and practice, speaking truth and doing justice, in three areas. The first is ancient Kemetic thought and symbolism, and I want to suggest to you that ancient Kemetic thought and symbolism is the key to our organizing. The second is speaking the truth, and I want to suggest to you that speaking the truth is the key to our education. And the third is doing justice, and I hope to suggest to you that doing justice is the key to our transformation. Ancient Kemetic thought, symbolism, organizing, for building for eternity, organizing is the question. And it seems to me that when we look at ancient Kemetic thought, we have to begin with a kind of adage that suggests that a people's theology is important. And I want to share with you that it is clear by now, I hope, in this audience, that we do not confuse theology with religiosity. And that when talking about theology, we're really talking about the rational study of the being of God. We're not talking about tambourine playing, we're not talking about incense burning, we're not even talking about ringing bells. When we're talking about theology, we're talking about the rational, logical study of the being of God. And it is said that the theology of a community assumes its truth, or the truth of that community's reality, at the given moment of that community's birth. Now that statement is very important because we have so often become conceptually incarcerated in terms of wondering where do we begin, or wondering what ideology, what theology, what psychology, what sociology is most appropriate for us, and we dabble in all other folks' stuff. And the rule is simple. If Marx was at the moment of our birth, then we can deal with Marx. If any other theoretician was at the moment of our birth, then we can deal with that person. As we look at child rearing practice, we look at strategies for revitalizing our community, the simple question to ask is, were they there when we were there? If they were not, we ought to be careful with adopting their theories and their strategies. It is important for us to see that the task of theology has been to study and to analyze the implications of the truth that was established at the moment of our birth. That's our current task, is to determine the implications of the ancient truth. It is not enough to go back and get all this good stuff and talk about how we did this and we did that and how great we were. We have to look at and be very, very thorough in analyzing what are the implications of our ancient and archaic truth for the now. Because if we don't do that, then our history, though revealed, becomes dead. And our history cannot be dead if we, in fact, use it in terms of drawing the implications from it. It seems to me that this notion becomes important because it allows us to ask a very basic, fundamental question. And that fundamental question is, what is our reason for being in the world? That's a question we should put over our babies' cribs. And as we nurse them to development, we should be humming the tune. What is our reason for being in the world? What is the truth of our reality, and how is that truth related to the moment of our birth as a people? It is through symbolism that the ancients gave us the scripture to understand the truth at the moment of birth. It is through symbolism. It's not through literal word, it's through symbolism. And so we have to begin to struggle with understanding these sort of esoteric and metaphysical and symbolic realms. And even though they seem strange and you can make some sort of statement that you know sounds dumb, but other people think is profound because you say, I'm dealing with symbolism. But that's not the way we're supposed to deal with this issue. We're supposed to begin to try to struggle to understand what it means to be, because that beingness was established at the moment of our birth. And the ancients taught us that our beingness had two fundamental aspects. And they were really perceptual aspects and, in some sense, cognitive illusions. But they were perceptual aspects. The ancients taught us that the visible realm was one aspect of being. But equally, there was an invisible realm that was the other aspect of being. And it's because we've been following gods not of our own that we've limited ourselves to dealing only in the visible. And when we talk about the invisible, it becomes spookism. It becomes that's sort of that occult stuff, and we don't want to do with that. When we're scientific or we're revolutionary, we're whatever, but we can't deal with that invisible stuff. But the ancients weren't talking foolishness. They were essentially arguing for us that the visible realm is the mortal, is the physical, and that the invisible is the immortal, is the spiritual. It is the visible that is thingness. It is the invisible that is no thingness. It is that nothingness, the no thingness, that is the spiritual. And our ancestors taught us that the visible and the invisible are actually one and the same, even though the invisible is far greater than the visible. What that says in sort of a very practical way is that this is me. This is me. But it is the we that is far greater than the me. That the me and the we are one and the same, even though the we is far greater than the me. We have to begin to look and conceptualize ourselves in a way that talks about that my visible me is related to the invisible spiritual we. So that as I see the black woman, I see the invisible me in her. I can't demean, dominate that which is me. As I see the black man, I can't be dissing the brother. Then there's another brother. I can't be talking about there's another brother doing the problem, because I see the relationship between me and we. I see the relationship between the invisible and the visible. The symbolic is important in ancient thinking because it really allows us to see very important laws that were governing our understanding of the world. The symbolic was a method. It wasn't just drawing sort of signs on walls and drawing images on the halls. The symbolic was a methodology. It was a method of transcribing the intuitive vision by the use of images. And the intuitive vision became a mode of investigation where the natural phenomena of the world stood as symbol to represent the invisible law that we had to understand. So when you place the hawk as a symbol, the hawk simply represented our intuitive vision for understanding the invisible law that undergird our way of knowledge. It is in this basis that the ancients told us that you are able to know only that which is already innate in you. The problem for us as African people is that we don't know what is in us, and therefore we are not able to innately know it. What we do is we say, shit don't feel right. Something's wrong. That something's wrong. Something's not right here. But we know it's in us, but we don't know yet how to do it in terms of a knowledge base. We haven't been able to do the analysis, and the instinct is still in us. The African instinct is still in us. We are able to know only that which is already innately in us. Now, I'm not talking about no sort of notion of a locked kind of potential where you can only do certain kinds of things. I'm really referring to the spirit that is in us is the spirit that represents everything in the universe. So the ancients were saying in symbolic language that we are only able to know that which is innately in us, and that which is innately in us is everything. There is nothing outside of the realm of African people. The ancients talked about and shared with us that the symbol should be viewed as the material, the visible representation of the immaterial. It is probably why, and this instinct notion is important, it is probably why African people pay so much attention to our appearance. Even to the point when we can call in our own memories how mamas and daddies would not want the children to be going out looking ashy or looking disarrayed and looking unkept, because they understood that the material, the visible, represented the invisible qualities and functions found in the universe. So if you looked raggedy, if you looked unkept, then you were giving a statement in symbolic methodology that said your essence, your nature was to be nothing. And so even though our grandmamas and grandfathers wouldn't talk about ancient Kemet or talk about being African people, they were engaged in a praxis that demonstrated they understood intuitively, innately, all that there was to know about the universe. And as they polished us up literally put Vaseline on our first day of school. Didn't have no Vaseline, you'd look over your shoulder and get a little lard so no one see it, and use that. But they polished us up and sent us off to school because they were making a statement. They were making an ancient African statement of praxis that said, if my child is glowing, is visibly demonstrating the spiritual essence of power, there is nothing that he cannot or she cannot accomplish. And so they expected excellence from us because they had already manipulated and engaged in the African praxis of symbolism. It is in this context that we go to the ancient texts and we even see not only the symbolic but the language that teaches us that it is our way, the way of the ancient African mind, that allows us to begin to talk about understanding our way. It is from the book of Knowing the Evolutions of Ra that the god Nebuchadnezzar records the creation of the birth of the gods. And it is stated, or it is said, I am he who evolved himself under the form of the god Khepera. I, the evolver of the evolutions. Think about that statement, the evolver of the evolutions. You can't be no more cause than that. I mean, if you are causing the cause, then you're it. So we have to begin to look at and understand what our ancestors were saying to us. I, the evolver of the evolutions in the developments which came forth from my mouth. No heaven existed, which came forth from my mouth. We can go quickly to West Africa and Central Africa and see the importance that African people placed on the power of the word, the nomo. That the word itself, the hearing of the word creates energy, creates heat. If you hear someone talking intensely, you get warm because the nomo is power. And the ancients said thousands of years ago that I am the evolver of the evolutions and the developments which came forth from my mouth. Take care in what we say to each other. The evolver of the evolutions and developments which came forth from my mouth. If we call each other nigger, we are creating the evolution of our own destruction. And white folks can go on vacation. We have to begin to be careful in understanding what we're talking about as we look at this question of organization and education and transformation. No heaven existed and no earth, and no terrestrial animals or reptiles had came into being. Blood is saying, I'm the beginning. I formed them out of the inert mass of watery matter. I found no place whereupon to stand. I was alone, and God's shoe and Tefnut had not gone forth from me. There existed none other who worked with me. I laid, and this is the other important statement for me in this passage, I laid the foundations of all things by my will. I didn't ask permission. I didn't petition. I didn't beg. I laid all the foundations of all things by my will, and all things evolved themselves therefrom. I united myself to my shadow and set forth Shu and Tefnut out of myself, thus being one God, I became three. And Shu and Tefnut gave birth to Nut and Seb, and Nut gave birth to Osiris, Horus, Kent, Sut, Isis, and Nephthys at one birth, one after the other, and their children, us, multiplied upon the earth. That's our Genesis story. We have to begin to understand where we come from. The essence of God, the moment of our birth, the truth at the moment of our birth is our barometer for measuring our potential, possibility. We have to begin to look and take back where we are and who we are. The essence of God is metaphysically revealed in the myth as thought in command, not good and evil. Look at the difference. The essence of God is thought in command, thought in will. We're struggling around here thinking about the good side and the bad side, the evil side and the saint side, the black side and the white side. The truth at the moment of our birth says that the essence is will and intent. And intelligence is to intend for your will to be done. That's our way. That's our way. So as we look at our beginning, at the moment of our birth, and I'm talking about our conscious birth, if we look at our birth, we can see that the ancients said that the divine law, when you boil it down and you look at all its many manifestations, the divine African law is to be. Is to be. Because in being, one can exert their will and their intent. If you are a doing person, you can get distracted. And because of, again, our conceptual incarceration, we run around here thinking that who we are is what we do. And so when they said you were slaves, we thought, when they gave us slave work to do, we thought we were slaves. Or at least we could have thought that we were slaves. But because we came from a tradition that Africans understood that who we are is that we be, that we knew we wasn't going to be no slave, even though we did slave work. See, so we have to begin to understand the reason why we're here in this room today is because our most immediate ancestors could spend 300 and 400 years doing slave work, but they never said, we be slaves. We be slaves. The one thing they said very clearly was that we will be free. So we need to look at ourselves in the context of where we come from. It is this divine law. It is this divine law, and we know in terms of, again, the study of theology, that divine law, that for every divine law there is a moral mandate, a mandate that goes along with the law. And the divine law, the African divine law is to be, the moral mandate is that in being, we must continually to become more better. More better. Every day, more better. Every day, more better. Today, I'm a slave. Tomorrow, I'm going to be free. More better. More better. So we have to look at our way and begin to see that it is inscribed in the symbolic methodology of our culture. It is, in fact, that symbolic methodology that allows us, we start thinking symbolically, that allows us to begin to see our history in different ways. The notion of transformation in the African tradition in ancient Kemet was called sometimes the alchemical process of transformation to perfectibility. That the charge of life, of being more better, is to move in every aspect of life from a lesser material being to a greater spiritual being. And this greater spiritual being didn't mean you're going to get invisible and fly off. The greater spiritual being meant that you were going to be in tune with the natural energy, the divine law of the universe. And it's when you are in tune with the natural law, the divine energy of the universe, there is nothing that one cannot do. It is the symbolic methodology that allows us to think a different way. And that's part of the struggle that I think that we're still in. We're approaching and marrying and working and having relationships with ancient data. But we're not thinking in the way of the ancients who created that data. So we're still looking at, and maybe I'll take this as my own limitation, I still find myself looking at ancient thought in a way that I've been trained to look at thinking from a Western model of ideas. And so as I become more better, I'm going to see more things in our way. And so we have to begin to try to break out of this conceptual incarceration. One example of this is found in the fact that some interpretations talk about the ancient, the thousands of years of ancient Kemet, of civilizations and different gnomes rising and falling, and different godheads becoming central, and people in different areas fighting for ascendancy in terms of whose god was going to be the god, much like we see ourselves doing today. But they also point out that as one civilization went into ruin, they would take the broken bricks and use those and take them down or up the Nile and use those to build a new building. So it was like scavenging the rummage to build a new condominium. What we didn't see, because we weren't thinking symbolically, is that the ancient practice of embedding ancient stones in the foundation of new buildings was not because you couldn't buy no new stones and had to use old stones. It was the belief that one picked the stone whose inscription and whose symbols that were on the ancient stones had relevance for the principles that should be taught in the new civilization. So we were seeding buildings like your grandmama made bread. She took a little of the dough from the old batch and saved it, put it aside. And then when she was making new bread, she put that old batch stuff in it because she knew she could guarantee the quality of the texture and the taste by using that which she saved from the time when she was most good. And that mo better required you to build on your last mo better. So you can't just start anew. You can't start anew. It is this thought that says, look at the inscription on the stone. So they weren't just scavenging around saying, oh, this block is good, let's take it. They were looking at the inscriptions on the stone, and then based upon those inscriptions, they created the next epoch, the next era, the next great high civilization of ancient Egypt. And we know that in terms of that now new way of thinking, that we can see that Memphis and Heliopolis and Hermopolis and Thebes weren't competing theologies that were fighting amongst themselves. That in Memphis, the creative principle that was inscribed in the symbolism of the building, this is chemical engineering, I hope you see. Chemical engineering. Let me say it again. Chemistry. Chem-mystery. Chemistry. Chemical engineering. That they were engaging in chem-mystery. Understand the mysteries of the black folk. That Memphis, the building of Memphis was built around the creative principle of unification. And we talk about the unification of North and South and Ptah and the Octet. But what we can see is that rises and falls. That as Heliopolis comes to place, Heliopolis takes the principle from the earlier principle and defines itself around the task of self-generation. I want to suggest that these notions may even have import for us in terms of psychotherapy, in terms of socialization of children, in terms of development, the issues of unification, the issues of self-generalization, comes back to this notion of will and intent. And then as Heliopolis rose and fell, Hermopolis takes its place, and we see Hermopolis building itself around the creative principle that in nature, all things are defined by the principle of unicity, that we can see unicity in all things. And then finally, when Hermopolis rises and falls and Thebes becomes the place of centralization, the creative principle becomes the notion that in being and in becoming, we are everything. We be, and we're going to be more better, we are everything. That we take on the attitude of being and being more better, we are everything. It is that divine law to be that we recognize that we really are the creative cause which makes us indestructible. As long as we believe someone else is our causality, then what they do, we must react to. And if they stop, we have to stop. If they become aberrant, become vulgar, become whatever, we have to react to them. It is only in recognizing that we are the creative cause that we become indestructible and invincible. That is the lesson that we can learn from the ancient way. That the moral mandate to become says that we reveal to ourselves that in being more better, in every day we must be more better, we must up the ante, then we really are eternal. Because this level of more better does end, but the next level just begins. And so we become eternal. Speaking the truth becomes an important requirement once we take ourselves into the framework of the ancient African symbolic methodology. Speaking the truth is the key to education. It is the key to education because speaking the truth tells us that it is the first principle of development, truth. It is the first principle, I believe, because it's embedded in what Naeem and myself call the really basis of psychology, the ancient Kemetic principle called Saku. And Saku was the understanding and the illumination, the eye or the soul of our being. And so psychology really was in ancient times in the African tradition was believed to be the study of the human spirit, not the study of pathology, not the study of behavior, not the study of rat conditioning. Psychology was the study of the human spirit, the study of human illumination, human understanding, the study of the glow that your mama created when she put the Vicks on your face. It is the study of understanding that the object is not what's real, it is the spiritual force that makes the object have movement. That is what's real. And so we are all psychologists. At least we who have decided we are reclaiming and rescuing the teachings of ancient Kemet, we are all psychologists, and if we are all psychologists, then we should be able to make the necessary mind transplants that our community needs. Our community has had a mind transplant, and we act like the monster Frankenstein because we do the will of Dr. Frankenstein. So we have to, so our job, it seems to me that our job is to engage in a praxis that allows us to recenter into our being the mentality of the African way, to do a mind transplant. And in doing that, the best stimulus for creating the mind transplant is to begin to speak the truth. We cannot speak the truth without beginning our conversation, at least in this place, by recognizing that all the negativity, all the deviance, all the aberrance, all the scars and ugliness we see in the African community are not our nature, but are the consequences of the singular ideological system of white supremacy. So if anybody asks us what's wrong with black folks, tell them it is white supremacy. If anybody asks you why black children can't learn, tell them it's white supremacy. If anybody asks you why we can't drive a car, tell them it's white supremacy. If anybody asks you why we can't pick our nose in public, tell them it's white supremacy. If they ask you anything is wrong about black people, you tell them to look at yourself and you'll find the reason. That we have to begin to stop apologizing, stop trying to come up with reasons why. That we ain't got no money, we ain't got no mama and no daddy in our homes, we ain't got no shoes, we ain't got no, the problem for us, if we teach the truth, is that African people were the only people who came to the Americas for the singular and sole purpose of human exploitation and dehumanization. All the other immigrants would come here. All these other folk will come and talk about they got here and they got a little Chinese store, a little Korean store, and they doing all good because they got all their kids in the store working with them. Say that's all fine and good, but you didn't come here. You didn't come here the way we came here. We didn't come here because we were escaping the potato famine. We didn't come here because we didn't like ourselves. We didn't come here because we got on a love boat and decided we went to the New World and found it nice and sent home to mommy and daddy for some money. We came here in a particular kind of relationship. And that relationship between black and white in this country is a relationship that black folks can no longer compromise with. We have to understand. In speaking the truth as part of our theme, in speaking the truth, we must teach our children that they can't compromise in any way with those whose original and permanent intent is the destruction of our humanity. We can't engage in polite conversation about the peculiar inferiority of black people. We can't engage in the polite conversation about I'm different from the other black folks and that's why I'm the only one in the university in this particular department. We can't engage in those conversations. We must teach the truth. We must speak the truth, and we must speak the truth that says the direct and indirect subjugation of all black people by white people is the basic purpose of their existence. That they, in fact, define themselves, define us as being only of value to the extent and to the degree that we are pleasing and serve their interest. And we engage in that. We tap for them, we dance for them, we entertain them. We even allow our emergence of blackness to become a fad. And as we begin to take on the accoutrements of Africanity, we don't spend the time to educate our children that wearing kente or the African shield is nice, but it is not decoration we're talking about. There is substance. There is a visible and an invisible. And that as you wear the visible signs of your Africanity, you must also engage in a systematic process of transformation so that you have the essence of being African, that you can no longer just put it on. You can no longer see that there is no area that we cannot have to struggle with the issues of white supremacy. It doesn't matter whether it's economics, whether it's education, whether it's entertainment, whether it's law, whether it's politics, whether it's religion, whether it is sex or war. In this country, we have to address there is no compromise when it comes to white supremacy and its operational form of racism. That we can no longer allow ourselves to see that all the things that make us situated, our land, our labor, and our life, have only value to the extent that white folks can exploit it. They exploit our music, they exploit our life, they exploit our creativity. We have to begin to recognize that we won't participate as we begin to speak the truth. We won't participate in the issue of black folks being valuable to the extent that we are the profit or the pleasure of white people. We cannot do it any longer. Speaking the truth. Speaking the truth tells us that the Europeans and later their Arab allies saw the value of African people in terms of the necessity of destroying the African family and deconstructing African manhood and African womanhood. That they saw that the only way they could control the spirit of African people was to deconstruct the sense of family, to remove us from seeing that the invisible and the visible are one and the same. They want us to believe in the supremacy of the individual so that we can separate ourselves from the condition of our brothers and our sisters, to destroy the sense of family, destroy the sense of peoplehood, to deconstruct the African manhood, the African womanhood. As we struggle today, we have to reconstruct what is the meaning of an African man, the meaning of the African woman, as these ideas flutter around in our communities about gender equity and manness and womanness, and we're trying to figure out what is our relationship. We got to be very careful, because we've been conditioned to follow God's, not our own. And as we follow other people's struggles, we end up thinking that the basic issue is the liberation of black women, or the basic issue is the liberation of black men, and we have to understand that the basic issue is the liberation of the African relationship. It is our relationship. It is our ability. It is our ability to be able to relate in an African essence that determines our ability to engage in that possibilities of being more better. I can't be more better without relating to that which gives me energy. You can't be more better. So it is not my this or me or you, it is the relationship that we raise up. It is the relationship between man and woman, the relationship between, as we talked about last night, the relationship between eldership and infantship. That we have to see that there's a necessity to be breathed on by our elders, to feel their energy, to feel their breath, to get the eye look from great mother, to see that eye that tells us you ain't doing it right, to see the eye that tells us you're doing so bad, do it some more, to see the eye that tells us you have the power, that even though I am an elder and I am old, I give you permission to kick butt. And black folk kick butt. If your mama tells you to fight, you don't have to worry about no coach. You don't have to worry about no preparation. So it's the elders that we have to begin to understand as part of our reclamation. And the third way that the Europeans and Arabs attempted to destroy our essence is by the delegitimation of our language or our ability to communicate. The whole notion that we communicate is the means of relationship. And so they attacked our ability to communicate as a way of distorting or destroying our relationship. So we struggle with thinking about how we're going to say it, or do we speak the proper English, whether it be the queens or the kings, it don't matter, it's not ours. So, but we still struggle with those issues and not realizing that it's not how we say something, it's not what we say, it is how we say it, and what determines how you say it is who you're saying it to. It's the relationship. It's a relationship. So I can say one thing to an elder brother and say the exact same literal words to a brother, my peer, and it's the way I say it that gives it meaning, not what I'm saying. We have to understand our relationship. We have to understand in teaching the truth, and speaking the truth, that we have had disruptive forces on the African sensibility. Those disruptive forces I have begun to codify as 6 essential events in continental Africa as well as diasporic Africa that has disrupted our essence, and in disrupting the African essence has distorted the African expression of who we are. So we don't look like, we don't act like the real, original, authentic African because our essence and our expression has been disrupted. And those are religious conversion, colonialism, and in terms of continental Africa, religious conversion, colonialism, decolonialism, neocolonialism, industrialization, and nationalism. And you can parallel those 6 events in terms of what it impacted upon in terms of the African essence and the African expression. In terms of diasporic Africa, here in the United States, the same things can be saw. We can see religious conversion. We can see this notion of New World slavery that parallels colonialism. We can see emancipation that parallels decolonialism. We can see reconstruction that parallels neocolonialism. We can see urbanization that parallels industrialization. And we can place this notion, or at least the first phase of black consciousness as paralleling nationalism. What did they disrupt? They disrupted our spiritual, material, conceptual, social, affective, and cognitive realms. They affected our rhythm. We're off balance. We're drunk. We're off center. And what we see that in our expression. We see it in terms of how we see the perceptual realm. We see things being white better than black. In the physical realm, we begin to see that our fundamental value is in the fact that we can run, jump, and do physical things and not mental things. We see it in the cognitive realm, where we begin to put caps on our ability to think and understand. We see it in the mental realm, where we don't even conceptualize the world as what it really is. And we see it in the emotional realm, where we begin to put boxes on ourselves about who we can feel about and what we can feel and how we can feel. And we see it in the political realm, where we begin to believe that it is our task simply to find those allies in the other alien world that can do for us what we can't do for ourselves. That's an expression that is distorted and is based upon systematic understandings of our way. So we understand, almost in a medical model, if we understand the path of the disease, we can reverse the path and define the healing process. That is the transformation of what we're talking about in this conference. It is Diop who shared with us his genius and argued that there were 3 factors which contribute to the cultural identity of any people: the historical, and you all know this, the historical, the linguistic, and the psychological. Diop argues that the historical factor is the cultural cement, and this is in Civilization of Barbarism, that the historical factor is the cultural cement that unifies the disparate and different elements of a people to make them into a whole. It is that historical band that unifies us and makes us into a whole by the particular slant that history places on our feelings about historical continuity and creates a totality of our collective. You have to ask the question, and we have to respect Diop, but not to deify Diop. We have to begin to see that Diop, as a good teacher, gave us more questions to answer than answers to memorize. And so Diop tells us by his analysis that we have to ask the question, what is meant by the feeling of historical continuity? Is it enough to put the timelines on the walls in the classrooms and have children see where we've come from? Or is that a feeling? What does Diop mean by the feeling of historical continuity? Is it the historical consciousness that engenders and allows a people to distinguish themselves as a people rather than a population? We have to begin to ask ourselves these questions, because these questions help us to reverse the disease process to a healing process. Historical consciousness provides a people with a feeling of cohesion. Take it back to the symbolisms of ancient Egypt. The first notion of unification, of unicity. Translated in modern language, it's cohesion. It is what Martin Luther King talked about when he referred to black folk. He called us his beloved community. He said, the beloved community, be in love with unity That's what beloved community means. Be in love, calm with unity. Be in love with unity. If we begin to think in our symbolic methodology, then we can read the scripture in nature that our leadership has provided us, even when they wouldn't call themselves Afrocentric. Even when they wouldn't, because their instincts, it is the instinctual nature of the African being to do African stuff, even when our minds, our heads, our training has taught us to use a different kind of thinking process, but when we dig deep in our own essence, we pull out the stuff that is our stuff. Unfortunately, the children can't read it because we have begun to see through the perceptual distortions of white supremacy. Diop says that it is that how does historical consciousness result in this feeling of cohesion? He argues that historical consciousness constitutes the safest and the most solid shield of cultural security for a people. Now that sounds good. I like that. I can use that. Historical consciousness constitutes the safest and most solid shield, put out in front of me, of cultural security for our people. But as the master teacher, Diop is really telling us, you have to answer what is cultural security. What does it mean? Does it mean that we have holidays every month? And that we put on our uniforms every month and we talk about we are secure in our cultural identity? These are questions that have to be asked and answered by us. Diop doesn't answer them. He just puts it out there. We have to begin to struggle with these fundamental issues because these are the things that our children need to be more better. We have to begin to look at it. This is why every people, in terms of this cultural security, every people seek only to know and to live their true history. No other people give voice to the truth of someone else's history, except us. Except us. We teach about George Washington's lie and Abraham Lincoln's illusions. We teach other people's history. No other people do that. No other people teach the truth of someone else's history. And we sit in shame and silence when we raise up the question of African-centered education and people try to challenge us and we forget that the basis of our education is truth. Is truth. We're not saying that we got to have African stuff because it's African people. We're saying that African-centered education is the only education that teaches the truth of the African experience to African people. And no other people have to apologize for that. It is essential. The essential thing is to rediscover the thread that connects them to the remotest past. Diop argues the essential thing, to rediscover that thread that connects us to our remotest, as far back as we can go, ancestral past. What is the essential thing? That's what we have to ask. We can't deify Diop. We can't just say Diop's there and we got it and we can go now. Diop is a master teacher. He's giving us more questions on the exam than study guides. See, so we have to answer the questions. The most efficient cultural weapon with which a people can arm itself is historical continuity. Diop gives us that. We have to keep that in mind, but we have to also answer the questions that are there. Diop also suggests to us that the linguistic factor, of the three factors, the linguistic factor is equally important. He suggests that the linguistic factor is the constituent element of cultural personality and cultural identity. And he goes, we have to ask the question, what does African linguistic unity mean? And how is it experienced? How it's experienced is more important even than what it means. We're not speaking Igbo. We're not speaking Yoruba. We're not speaking Fulani. So are we removed from the African cultural unity, the African cultural identity, because the linguistic factor, as defined in the formal study of languages, is removed from us? What does African linguistic unity mean? Is it what we speak? Is it how we speak? Is it who we speak? Is it all of the above? Those are questions we have to answer. Diop doesn't give that to us, and scholarship hasn't given to us, and we're not going to find that in the psycholinguistic literature in the academy. That's our challenge. Our challenge is to define these things. The one thing that I offer as a contribution is the definition of power. Power is the ability to define reality and to have other people respond to your definition as if it were their own. We have to take the power. And it is my humble criticism of Diop that I believe because he was so thoroughly trained in linguistics that even the giant genius of Diop was incarcerated by the methodology and the theory of language, and that we have to be careful in just taking the methodologies and the theories that we've inherited as being trained in a white supremacy system of education and use those to analyze African things. So we have to begin to rethink, take power and define even what language means. Define what language means, define what the relationship means. The third principle that Diop shares with us and guides us through is the psychological factor. And you obviously know that when I got to the psychologically section, I was really interested here. Diop says that the psychological factor is traditionally grasped in the qualitative way through which literature is presented, especially poetry. And he suggests that it is this qualitative way through which literature is grasped that the other two factors, history and linguistics, are susceptible to rigorous scientific analysis. I think that Diop, again with all due respect, Diop may have been blinded by his own personal opposition to the negritude poets, who begin trying to develop a notion of the African personality through the literature and the poetry of the African spirit, and not the illumination and the understanding of the African soul. And so when he did that, he... Now I gotta tell you, my sister said, say it one more time, slow down. But then she tells me, we got to hurry, get out of here. So now, I'm in a dilemma here now. So I'm trying to get through this. Yeah. Diop suggests that the psychological factor is important because the psychological factor that has been primarily defined in terms of literature, i.e. through poetry, that the psychological factor is important because the other two factors, history and linguistics, are susceptible to rigorous scientific analysis only through understanding them. You can't understand what he's saying is you can't understand the psychological factor directly. You have to understand the psychological factor by way of understanding the historical and the linguistics. And my critique of that is that Diop, in his own intellectual opposition to the negritude poets, who begin talking about an African personality through literature and through poetry, Diop was intellectually in opposition to them, so he relegated the psychological factor as being less important in terms of scientific analysis because he thought it could only be done, scientific analysis could only be done in literature and in history. And I want to suggest to you, and into Diop's memory, that the psychological factor can be submitted to scientific analysis if we put in our heads the right methodology and the right symbolic system that allows us to explain our essence and our expression. Even though it is done, you see it in our literature, you see our essence in our literature and in our poetry, but you also see our essence in the way we wake up in the morning and approach our children, the way we deal with work, the way we deal with play, the way we deal with the creative moment. And so we have to begin to rethink that issue. What are the questions, again, that my master teacher directs me to, is what are the psychological and cultural invariants? What's the stuff that doesn't change? What are the psychological and cultural invariants that political and social revolutions leave intact? Yeah. It's an important question. We get all this shit thrown on us. Yeah. Butt kicking all the time, giving up stuff, give it up, give it up, give it up. What's important for us to know is not what we're giving up, but what things have remained intact in spite of white supremacy, in spite of domination, in spite of exploitation, because that core stuff is the resiliency factor that we can build on to rehabilitate all those things that we've given up. So we have to begin to see that there is something here. Diop asked in the light of Africa becoming more individualistic, and when Diop in his writing talks about Africa becoming more individualistic, we can talk about the whole African world becoming more individualistic. And he asked the question, how can one explain the feeling of cultural identity through this permanent change? I raised the question. Diop is telling us that there's a permanent change that's the consequence of our domination and exploitation? Or is the African way to say that change is continual? We're going to be more better. So maybe there was not a permanent change in the African beingness. There is a momentary stagnation in our development. And when we're standing still, we think we are permanently changed. But as we think, we can begin to reconceptualize ourselves and think in a different way. So I conclude that the historical and linguistic factors, and I kind of turn Diop's perception upside down and suggest that the historical and linguistic factors really constitute the coordinates or the reference points in relationship to our psychic changes. You can analyze our history and our language as a barometer for measuring our psychic changes. We are the illumination. As we go through destructive systems of exploitation, we no longer glow. And so the historical moment of exploitation dulls the African spirit. What we see is the dulling of the African spirit, and we see that through the historical moment. What we have to do is not talk about historical moment, but talk about what kind of historical conditions must we create in order to re-illuminate the African spirit. We have to begin to think through these things in a way that gives us keys to action. Keys, if you will, to doing justice. Doing justice. The analysis is not important if it doesn't lead us to the point of doing justice. And it is in our tradition that, again, we return to the moment of our birth. Because in returning to the moment of our conscious birth, we understand the question of what is our purpose in this world. The ancients told us that doing justice was really part of the symbolism of Ma'at, and that the symbolism of Ma'at speaks to truth, justice, righteousness, harmony, balance, propriety, and order. That those 7 principles become the key, the building blocks, the prescription, the blueprint for doing justice. That Ma'at represents the proper quality of African being and becoming. Let me say that again. Ma'at represents the quality of African being and becoming. Being African means standing in truth. Being African means just, righteousness, harmony. Being African means due balance, due propriety, due order. I always point out the fact that propriety is an important one, because even in our doing Ma'at, or doing justice, if you will, in our communities, when the bum and the derelicts and the brothers got on the corner who had no job and had really sort of become the outcast of the community and were drinking out of the dirty, nasty wine bottle and using vulgar language, when the sister walked by, the bum said, "Oops, excuse me, ma'am. Excuse me, ma'am," because the bum, the derelict, understood doing justice. Understood doing justice and never heard about no Ma'at, never heard about no Kemet, never heard about no ancient Africa. But it was the instinct of the African residual that's been in our culture from the moment we began in this life. Those residuals and those retentions, the instinct that ushered us to say there is, in fact, proper conduct. There is proper conduct that we must engage in. It is Ma'at that the ancients defined in terms of us understanding intellectually this notion of proper conduct. It was Ma'at that says that in the cosmic expression of the universe must be understood in terms of it being an edifice of harmony, order, stability, and security. You could guarantee that the Nile was going to rise and recede. That's understanding stability and security. It was Ma'at that understood, that the ancients taught us to understand that the metaphysical realm, the metaphysical expression, is to recognize that behind everything, behind the visible, is in fact the invisible that speaks to uprightness, that speaks to righteousness, that speaks to truth, that speaks to justice. As we see the behavior out front, we see the behavior out front, but we have to get behind the behavior to see whether it is in fact righteous. That's what happens in the bars in the community where sisters and brothers are talking, and brothers are running that front thing up front and talking all that old wop about who he is, and the sister gets right behind that and sees where the truth is and asks, what are you really about? Who are you? It is the same principle. It is the same metaphysical principle that allows when in our development, before we got off center, and boys would go to girls' homes and knock on the doors and try to talk about wanting to date, and daddies and mamas would sit them down, and the first question they would ask was the metaphysical question. Who is your people? That's a metaphysical question. We don't think about it. We think they're getting in my business. We think they're getting too nosy and y'all upset. But the metaphysical question was to ask who was responsible for instilling in you righteousness, instilling in you truth, instilling in you a love for justice, because you take my child out here. I expect you to do the right thing. And I can't judge whether you will do the right thing based upon what you say. I can judge whether you do the right thing based upon who made you, who produced you, who made you be, who is your people, is a metaphysical question. We have to begin to see ourselves and understand our behavior in the context of our own intellectual psychology. The physical expression of Ma'at was the rulership that governed the building of the pyramids. The physical expressions of Ma'at said things must be level, even, straight, correct, regular, and balanced. That's the pyramid. And that same physical thing was really what? The physical manifestation of the spiritual. There's the visible and there's the invisible. And when we see the perfect pyramid, we're seeing a people saying, I am giving to the world a symbol that represents who we are. Take that and try to distort it because we built it not for today, but for eternity. We have to understand. We have to see the connections and see the connections in our symbolic world. We have to see the fact that the 7 cardinal virtues of Ma'at, truth, justice, righteousness, harmony, balance, propriety, in order that were inscribed 3,000 years ago, were in the energy of the universe. And when Maulana Karenga reached down into his creative genius and pulled out the Nguzo Saba, he pulled out a system that was part of a prescription for black healing that was consistent with the ancient cardinal virtues of 3,000 years ago. Before Maulana began to use his creative genius to understand the systems of ancient Kemet, the ancestors speak to us and through us, and they direct us. And so when he came up with unity, self-determination, collective work and responsibility, cooperative economics, purpose, creativity, and faith, he was given currency, modern currency, to truth, justice, righteousness, harmony, balance, propriety, and order. Our way is in the air. Our way is there for us to see. And it is Brother Dr. soon-to-be Elder Jake Carruthers who has taught us that doing justice can be seen and prescribed in the 3 basic positions of the African-centered movement. And Jake says to us that the African-centered movement ascribes to the belief that there is a universal, distinct African worldview, which should be the foundation for all African spiritual, psychological, intellectual, social, political, economic, and artistic development. It is that belief in a distinct African worldview that when we talk about doing justice, we can look at the path of time and see that in ancient Thebes, our ancestors said that Amun, the God Amun, or the force Amun, was the power of God, the generative capacity. And as we move from North Africa and go to the Bantu peoples of South Africa, we see our people saying that Intu was the force of God, the thing that gives us the universal African worldview. And as we move from South Africa to the Dogon people of Central Africa, the Dogon teach us that the Nomo was the vital force of God, the word that allows us to see the universal African worldview. And as we move from Central Africa to West Africa, we see the Akan people telling us that the cry was the divine breath of God. The consistency is over and over again. And as we leave the continent of Africa and go to the land of the Busa people, Black USA, blacks in the United States of America. As we move to the land of the Busa people in North America, we see that the Busa people told us before we got off our center, they told us that the essence of being is that the black man, the black woman has to have soul, heart, soul. And then white folks take it, we get confused and begin to engage in stuff like blue-eyed soul and blonde-eyed soul. We cannot compromise our essence by sharing it with someone else. But the fact of the matter, is that from North Africa, South Africa, Central Africa, West Africa, and the Busa people of the Americas, there's been one consistent thing. And that consistent thing is that there is an African essence. There is an African essence that drives the universal African worldview, which has to be the foundation of what we do. Brother Jake taught us teaches us that the second principle of position of the African-centered movement is that it advocates for the restoration of the historical truth as a priority for the guiding force of our scholarship and our practice. And I have offered in extension that the advocacy really is the advocacy for the restoration of the African character as the basis for determining our historical truths. It is that African character that is so critical, because as you analyze and look at the train or the chain of African historical events, it is only at those times and in those places that time and space was ruled by the African character that we see great achievement. As soon as we change, as soon as we integrate, as soon as we follow God's not our own, we see a downturn in our greatness. So it is the character that becomes an important principle for us looking at, and I suggest to you and offer to you that the African character is the complex of mental and ethical traits that distinguish us as a people. And that those ethical traits can be defined, again, by codifying and collapsing our values and our virtues and putting them out in front of us and teaching our children that the ethical traits of the African character are the virtues of mind: truth, justice, righteousness, harmony, balance, propriety, and order. Those are our virtues, that we can talk about the virtuous black man. We can talk about the virtuous black woman by asking who stands on truth. Back and who determines harmony by their presence in the community, by asking who establishes order where there is disorder in our community. That's the virtuous African man or African woman. We can teach our children that the African character is a character that is based upon value or values, and that our values begin with respect for eldership. Our values begin with responsibility for our children. Our values begin with having restraint in what we do. Our values begin with allowing our relationships to be ruled by reciprocity, and our values begin by talking about the resiliency of our condition when we are confronted with imbalance. Our values are respect, responsibility, restraint, reciprocity, and resiliency. We can teach our children that there is a mental attitude, there is a way of thinking that's black folk thinking, that we think a certain way, and those thinking is tied to and reflected in our attitudes and in our attributes. And our attitudes and attributes come from the ancient scripture that talks about the 10 principles of initiatory mastery, that our attitude is driven by the sense of appropriateness. You don't do anything and everything anywhere. That our attitude is driven by the sense of excellence, that whatever it is, we're going to do it more better. That our attitude is driven by faith that our teachers will teach us the truth. That our attitude is driven by being free from resentment when someone wrongs you. Sometimes we got to question that because we get wronged so many times that maybe we got to give some shit back to somebody, but we can We can refine some things if necessary, but we have to also talk about an attitude that says be free from resentment when you are wrong. And that sometimes we do wrong stuff to each other and we hold resentment that contaminates the relationship that we have in building the beloved community that Martin Luther King talks about. An attitude that says, first and foremost, it is our obligation and responsibility to teach in our children pride in their race. That we're not going to apologize for saying, yes, you are black, yes, you are African, and there is no one, nowhere better than you. We need to teach our children. We need to teach our children to have what Marcus Garvey used to call race men and race women, race pride. We to see that as part of our obligation for creating and manipulating and massaging the mental attitudes that represent the African way. And ultimately, we have to teach an attitude in our people that as they become more better and become the most better, more better person that's around, that in being more better, they must also be humble in the face of their community. That we can never let our more better separate us from our community. That humility is part and parcel of the African mental attitude as we recreate the African character. The attributes that are important that we've identified and used in our teachings and work in the African community, the attributes that are part of the mental traits are attributes of mastery. Not just learning, mastery. And again, in the 10 principles, literary mastery, the first mastery is mastery of one's own thought. We have to stop thinking like white people. We have to stop placing white people up in deification. The attack that I enjoyed by hanging out with Lenin is that I suggested in one discussion that Greek philosophy is vomit. And we should stop being the vomit drinkers. Now, let me take a minute to explain that, because if you don't think symbolically, you just think that I'm talking about this stuff is funky and nasty. If you understand that anytime the body goes into a new environment, its digestive system and its dietary habits become shocked by the new texture and the new quality of the substance that it must intake. And when you intake that substance and it is new to you, you either have diarrhea or you vomit until your system gets acclimated to the richness of the new substance. When Greece went into Africa under affirmative action programs, they took a rich diet of intellectual abilities in their system. The paleness of their system could not accommodate the richness of our diet, and so they began to vomit. And when they vomited, what the world received was Greek philosophy. Now, for the record, in case there is a brother or sister who's a reporter that's going to report this again, I want to break this down because sometimes symbolic thought is hard to comprehend. The statement, the admonition, don't be the vomit drinkers, is to say that if you see vomit and you are a scientist, you don't drink the vomit, you analyze the texture and the quality and the ingredients of the substance to determine what was its original form. So black scholars, black intellectuals, rather than drink Greek philosophy as vomit, we must know Greek philosophy, analyze it, critique it, determine what was its original form, its original constitution, so we can go back to the original source. That's the purpose. That's the purpose of our scholarship. Our scholarship is to recognize that there is no substance, no state, no condition that we cannot master and understand, and if it is our pleasure to determine how it was derived based upon its connection to the original thing of all things, which is the African way. The attributes of the African mental trait then is to have the cognitive flexibility to be able to deal with all that which is Western thought, and at the same time go to the left side and deal with that which gave birth to Western thought, and don't see them as antithetical or opposite continuums. That Western thought is truly the thinking of children, and that if we are to reclaim our position as the parents and the adult and the continuum of humanity, then we must begin to think as adults. And we see our children having temper tantrums because they cannot express themselves in a way that we as adults are accustomed to. We don't say that ours is in opposition to the child. We simply recognize that the child is immature. We don't have to talk about white thought being in opposition to black thought, because that's not true. That white thought is infantile thinking, and that if you love children, if you have the desire, you may want to give them an educational system that will allow them to evolve to the higher level. African-centered education is good for any human being, because to be human is to be African. And the final two attributes that I would like to offer to you, or the final three attributes that are part of our mental trait, is courage, is an attribute. Courage, the ability to struggle, to not be afraid, to tell the truth in our intellectual, mental enterprise. Defiance, the ability to stand up and say, I defy you to prove me wrong. But the issue that we can take from the methodologies and the epistemologies of the Western world is that we can always throw to them the no. I argue that Africa is the origin of humanity. If you think that is wrong, then I will recast it as the null hypothesis and suggest that you simply disprove it. I don't have to prove it. I do not scientifically have to prove it. You have to disprove it. That is defiance. And the final attribute is integrity, that we must, in our beingness, in our becoming, see as a mental trait integrity. Integrity, to be able to stand upright, to be able to not compromise on the truth, to be able to say, I will not even mask it and make it palatable in mixed company. The truth is the truth, wherever we find it. It is the African-centered movement that collapsed these notions that Jake has offered us, because the final third point that he makes in the positions of African-centered education, African-centered movement, is the acknowledgement that the precondition for the freedom of the African mind is the development of healthy human functioning African people, is the massive African-centered education and re-education of African people throughout the world. That's our charge. That's what we are creeping up to. That is the movement that African people are now clarifying as our movement for the 90s. The massive re-education and education of African people that's centered in an African pedagogy and praxis. That's not just about curriculum, it's about the relationship in the classroom, it is about the relationship of the school to the community, it is about the development of human beings, that the objective being to promote the next generation of African people. The only definition of education that we should hold in front of ourselves is a definition that says education is simply and most assuredly the process of intentionally and objectively reproducing and refining the best of ourselves. That's what education is. Reproduce and refine the best of ourselves. If we look at our grandchild, and we can't see a refinement of our great-grandfather, we have done miseducation. If we allow an educational system to educate our children so that when they come home, we do not recognize them as a refinement of the best of ourselves, we have submitted our children to genocide. We have to understand what it's about. The intent of education is to reproduce and refine the complex of mental and ethical traits which signify the distinctive quality of African people, in which in turn maximize our human functioning and our human potential. The purpose of education is simply and straightforwardly, in my estimation, self and social sovereignty, rulership. The purpose of education is not to get a good job. The purpose of education is not to be able to get you somewhere in the suburbs with the aliens. The purpose of education is self and social sovereignty. Education for mastery, education for rulership, education for governance relative to self, family, community, society, and the world. When we send our child to school, when we send children to school, as we reinstitute, reclaim, rescue, and reestablish an African-centered education, then we can guarantee that when that child comes home, he will be on the path of development where he or she will feel comfortable and natural with rulership, comfortable and natural with governorship, comfortable and natural with understanding that their divinely inscribed relationship is to be the ruler of self, the ruler of family, the governor of community, the governor of society, and ultimately the African reclamation of the governance of the world. We are psychologists, each and every one of us. And in the book African Psychology, I would like to close with a poem that I wrote as a preface to this book. The poem says to black psychologists, I was writing to my colleagues, but I'm sharing this with all of us now because I think it's apropos. We, African people, are standing in the river. Alone, we shall be swept away by its currents. United, we can know the many rivers to cross. Individually, we shall drown in its depths. Combined, the river will guide us to a higher ground. Singularly, we are halted by the torrent of its banks. As one people, the river shall carry us to a distant place. As one people, the river shall return us to the source. Black psychologists, black people, we are standing in the river, transformed and transforming. Thank you very much.